Picture this. December 1953. A father stands in the bitter cold outside Macy's department store at 5 in the morning, his breath turning to fog in the New York winter air. He's been waiting for 3 hours and he won't be the first one through those doors. Behind him, a line stretches around the city block. Mothers clutching handwritten lists, children bundled in wool coats that smell like mothballs, their eyes wide with anticipation. They're not waiting for a sale. They're waiting for something that no longer exists in our world, the magic of Christmas when it actually meant everything. Before you scroll away, before you dismiss this as just another nostalgia piece, ask yourself this. When was the last time Christmas made you feel something real? When did the holiday season stop being about wonder and become about surviving Black Friday? Stay with me because what happened to Christmas in the 1950s wasn't just a moment in history. It was the last time an entire nation believed in something together, and what we lost might be more important than you think. The year 1945 changed America forever. When the soldiers came home from World War II, they returned to a country that had been holding its breath for 4 years. Families had lived through rationing, through fear, through the very real possibility that evil might win. And when it didn't, when those boys came marching home, America exhaled. But it wasn't just relief that flooded through the nation. It was a hunger, a desperate, clawing need to believe in goodness again. Christmas became the vessel for that belief. In the immediate post-war years, between 1945 and 1950, Christmas fulfilled what researchers would later identify as 3 fundamental psychological needs. It renewed community goodwill that had seemed absent during the war, it reconnected people with an idealized past that felt safer than the present, and it offered a chance to preserve childhood innocence in a world that had proven itself capable of unimaginable darkness. These weren't trivial functions. In a nation that had just witnessed the Holocaust, dropped atomic bombs, and lost over 400,000 of its sons, Christmas became the psychological rehabilitation of the American spirit. And here's what made the 1950s different from any decade before or since. For the first time in American history, the middle class had money to spend on that belief. Real GDP growth averaged over 4% per year throughout the 1950s. Unemployment stayed below 5% for most of the decade. The average family income jumped from $3,300 in 1950 to $5,400 in 1959. A 64% increase. $200 billion in war bonds matured, and the GI Bill financed an educated workforce that built the suburbs, bought the houses, and filled them with children who would become the largest generation America had ever seen. If you're starting to see why this matters, if you're realizing that Christmas in the 50s wasn't just about tinsel and turkey, then you're exactly where I need you to be. Hit that subscribe button because we're about to go deeper into the machinery that built the American Christmas, and I promise you, it's not what you've been told. Money alone doesn't create meaning, but in 1950s America, prosperity and psychology merged into something unprecedented. At the beginning of the decade, only 9% of Americans owned a television. By 1960, over half of all households had one. That black and white box in the living room didn't just entertain families. It synchronized them. Every Monday at 9 p.m., America gathered to watch I Love Lucy, sponsored by Philip Morris Cigarettes. But it was the Christmas specials that wielded real power. Television reinforced what scholars call traditional family values through shows like Leave It to Beaver and Father Knows Best. These programs presented an idealized version of family life with clear gender roles and suburban settings, depicting the American dream that millions aspired to achieve. During Christmas season, these families didn't just exist on screen. They became templates. The mother in her apron, the father with his pipe, the children in their pressed clothes gathered around the tree. This wasn't reality, but it became the standard against which reality was measured. The advertisements between those programs did something equally powerful. They sold identity. Department stores developed intense marketing campaigns that posed a simple question. Are you a modern person? If you were, you needed specific products. Christmas became the annual performance where families proved their modernity, their success, their worthiness. The ease of obtaining credit cards were brand new in the 50s, translated into buying power that the middle class had never experienced. Things were cheap relative to disposable income, and the expansion of consumer credit paralleled the boom in homeownership and holiday spending. This wasn't shallow materialism, though it's easy to judge it that way from our current vantage point. Ownership of goods had become equated with success and happiness, yes, but it was also equated with security. Every new appliance, every toy under the tree, every string of lights on the house was a declaration. We survived. We made it through. We are building something that war cannot destroy. Consider the Sears Wish Book. This wasn't just a catalog. When it arrived in mailboxes each fall, children treated it like scripture. They would spend weeks circling items, making lists, negotiating with siblings over who wanted what. The act of wanting, of hoping, of believing that Christmas morning might bring that specific toy, this was the ritual that made the holiday sacred. And parents participated with equal reverence, joining Christmas club savings programs throughout the year, setting aside small amounts each week so that come December, they could afford to fulfill those wishes. The department stores themselves became cathedrals of Christmas. Macy's had been advertising itself as the home of Santa Claus since 1861, but it wasn't until the post-war era that the department store Christmas reached its zenith. Families would travel from surrounding states to see the window displays, elaborate animated scenes that told stories of angels, of Santa's workshop, of winter wonderlands. Inside, children would wait in lines that wrapped through entire floors just to sit on Santa's lap for 30 seconds. The department stores created entire attractions. Santa's workshop with real reindeer borrowed from petting zoos, Santa's secret shop where children could enter alone, without parents, to buy gifts in an enclosed mini shopping area. This is the moment to pause and recognize something crucial. We're not just talking about shopping. We're talking about community ritual. The Friday after Thanksgiving, what we now call Black Friday, though that term didn't exist yet, wasn't about violence and door-busting sales. It was about downtown streets filled with families, about Christmas lights turned on in synchronized ceremonies, about the first snowfall making everyone believe in magic again. You're halfway through this story and I need you to understand, what comes next is where the magic gets codified into the traditions we recognize today. If you want to understand why Christmas feels different now, why something essential has been lost, you need to see how these traditions were born. Like this video if you're still with me because we're about to meet the characters who built the mythology. 1949. A song hit the radio that would sell 2.5 million copies in its first year, eventually reaching 25 million sales and remaining the second best-selling record of all time until the 1980s. Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer wasn't a centuries-old Christmas carol. It was a marketing campaign that became mythology. Robert L. May, a struggling copywriter at Montgomery Ward department store in Chicago, created Rudolph in 1939 as a promotional booklet. May's life at that time was marked by tragedy. He was a widower with 2 children, and he poured his own experience of being an outsider into the story of a reindeer with an unusual nose who gets bullied until his difference becomes his greatest asset. The booklet was free and Montgomery Ward distributed 2.4 million copies. It disappeared during the war years, but in 1947, C.O. Sewell Avery made an unprecedented move. He gave May the full rights to his creation. May's brother-in-law, Johnny Marks, adapted the story into a song and pitched it to country singer Gene Autry, who initially showed no interest. Autry's wife convinced him to record it. On June 27, 1949, Autry laid down the track. By Christmas week, it hit #1 on Billboard. Here's why this matters. When Clement Clarke Moore wrote A Visit from St. Nicholas in 1823, he named 8 reindeer. For over a century, those were Santa's reindeer. Then a department store copywriter added a 9th, and within a single Christmas season, Rudolph became as canonical as Dasher and Dancer. That's not just successful marketing. That's the creation of modern mythology in real time. The same year, 1949, another piece of Christmas mythology was solidifying its place in American culture. White Christmas, written by Irving Berlin and recorded by Bing Crosby in 1942 for the film Holiday Inn, was selling millions of copies every December. This song did something revolutionary. It created a secular Christmas that all Americans, including Jewish immigrants like Berlin himself, could embrace. It mentioned no religious elements, no Jesus, no angels, no wise men, just snow, sleigh bells, and a longing for home. Songs like Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas from 1943 followed the same formula, tapping into universal desires for family and togetherness rather than specific religious observance. This wasn't the death of religious Christmas. Midnight Mass on Christmas Eve remained one of the most attended services of the year, with churches setting up folding chairs in aisles to accommodate overflow crowds. But the 1950s created something new, a Christmas that could be both sacred and secular, both deeply meaningful and wonderfully commercial, both traditional and modern. And then, in December 1955, something happened that perfectly encapsulated the strange magic of 50s Christmas. A Sears Roebuck and Company advertisement in a Colorado Springs newspaper invited children to call a phone number to talk to Santa Claus. But there was a typo in the ad. The number that printed wasn't Sears. It was the top-secret hotline for the Continental Air Defense Command, a red phone reserved exclusively for the U.S. President and four-star generals during international emergencies. It was the height of the Cold War. When that phone rang and a 5-year-old voice asked, "Hello, is this Santa?" the operations commander, Colonel Harry Shoup, initially thought it was a joke. He confronted the child, who burst into tears. Shoup quickly changed tactics and bellowed, "Ho ho ho," taking on the role of Santa himself. More calls followed throughout the day, all from children who had dialed the mistyped number. Instead of shutting it down, Shoup's staff put an image of a reindeer and sleigh on the tracking board they used to monitor airborne objects. They began tracking Santa's journey around the world, telling children where he was currently delivering presents. That accidental tradition became the NORAD Tracks Santa program, which continues today and receives over 70,000 calls each Christmas Eve. Think about what this means. At the absolute height of nuclear anxiety, when American military personnel were on constant alert for Soviet bombers, the Defense Command dedicated resources to tracking Santa Claus. The line between genuine military preparedness and childhood wonder became intentionally blurred. Santa was adapted to soothe Cold War fears about space travel and nuclear weapons. If NORAD could track Santa's sleigh, then children could believe that the same technology keeping them safe from missiles was also ensuring Christmas would happen. This is the heart of what made 50s Christmas different. The entire apparatus of post-war American power, the military, the corporations, the media, the government, aligned itself with the preservation of childhood belief. This wasn't cynicism. This was a generation that had seen what happened when belief died, and they were determined that their children would never have to stop believing in magic. We're in the final stretch now, and I need you to stay with me because here's where we confront what was lost and what that loss means for us today. If you've made it this far, you deserve to know the truth about why Christmas will never feel this way again. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that what we're missing isn't just nostalgia, it's something deeper. The physical traditions of 50s Christmas were elaborate and time-consuming in ways that seem almost incomprehensible now. Families made paper chains by hand, cutting strips of colored construction paper and gluing them into interlocking loops. Children practiced craft skills and patience, and each loop was symbolic, representing the unbreakable bonds of family. While we now have countless complex store-bought ornaments, paper chains remind us that 50s Christmas valued time spent together over the value of material things. Bubble lights, those strange hypnotic tubes filled with colored liquid that bubbled when heated by a light bulb, appeared on nearly every tree. Aluminum Christmas trees, which seem garish to modern eyes, were the height of fashion, representing space-age modernity. Some families bought Lionel train sets that ran on tracks circling the base of the tree, tiny locomotives pulling cars through a miniature landscape of houses and churches dusted with fake snow. These weren't decorations you threw up in an afternoon. They were installations that transformed living rooms into Christmas worlds. The food traditions were equally elaborate. Cookie exchanges became popular, with women in neighborhoods baking dozens of different varieties to trade with each other. The rise of canned goods and convenience foods created bizarre new traditions. Green bean casserole became a Thanksgiving and Christmas staple, Jell-O salads and increasingly strange combinations appeared on holiday tables. These weren't timeless traditional recipes. They were brand new, invented by food companies and embraced by a generation that saw convenience as modernity. But they became traditions nonetheless because tradition is simply what we do together, repeatedly, with intention. Christmas Club savings programs at local banks allowed working-class families to save throughout the year specifically for holiday spending. This wasn't credit. This was discipline, planning, sacrifice. Parents would deposit small amounts weekly, and the bank would release the accumulated funds in November or December. The anticipation wasn't just for children. Parents anticipated too, knowing exactly how much they had saved, planning purchases down to the dollar. And here's what made it all cohere. Big family gatherings were still possible. The post-war prosperity and strong labor unions meant that most workers had both Christmas Eve and Christmas Day off. Extended families lived in closer proximity. The Great American Migration to spread across the country hadn't yet fully happened. Grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins all gathered in homes that were crowded and loud and filled with the specific chaos of multiple generations occupying the same space. Board games were played, with Monopoly being particularly popular. Families read Christmas stories aloud, everything from Dickens to Dr. Seuss. They listened together to special radio and television programs, not on individual devices in separate rooms, but gathered around single speakers and screens. On Christmas Eve, many families attended midnight mass regardless of how religious they were the rest of the year. Mary Beth Fulton of Lincoln, Nebraska, remembers her mother fixing her hair in pin curls and dressing her and her siblings in new dresses with black patent leather shoes. After a traditional fish dinner, her father would ask the children to kneel in front of the Christmas tree and say a prayer before going to St. Wenceslas Catholic Church, where folding chairs would be set up in the aisles to handle the overflow crowd. These midnight services were considered the main event, the moment when families gathered to acknowledge the real meaning of Christmas. But here's the uncomfortable truth we need to face. The magic of 50s Christmas was built on a foundation that was already cracking. The idealized nuclear families on television were overwhelmingly white. The prosperity was not equally distributed. The traditional gender roles that seemed so stable required women to perform enormous amounts of unpaid labor. The decorating, the baking, the shopping, the wrapping, the hosting. Female homemakers were tasked not just with executing Christmas, but with the psychosocial care of their families and the rehabilitation of the national spirit. That's an impossible burden to place on any group of people. The consumerism that felt like abundance in the 50s set patterns that would eventually hollow out the meaning it was supposed to express. When ownership of goods becomes equated with success and happiness, what happens when you can't afford the goods? The keeping up with the Joneses mentality that emerged in suburban neighborhoods created anxiety alongside abundance. If your neighbors got a new car and you didn't, what did that say about you? The mythology being created, Rudolph, the NORAD tracker, the department store Santas, was largely corporate mythology. These weren't traditions passed down through generations. They were marketing campaigns that succeeded so spectacularly that they became indistinguishable from authentic culture. We can appreciate what they created while also acknowledging what they were. And perhaps most importantly, the unified national Christmas of the 1950s was only possible because television, radio, and limited retail options created a monoculture. Everyone watched the same shows, heard the same songs, shopped at the same stores, wanted the same toys. That synchronization created powerful shared experiences, but it also erased difference, marginalized minority voices, and enforced conformity. So here's what we lost and what we didn't. We lost the economic security that made elaborate Christmas celebrations accessible to working-class families. We lost the geographic proximity that enabled big family gatherings. We lost the cultural synchronization that let an entire nation believe in the same magic at the same time. We lost the labor unions that ensured workers got holiday time off. We lost the main streets and local department stores that created community gathering spaces. But we didn't lose the need for Christmas magic. We didn't lose the hunger for belief, for goodwill, for connection with something larger than our individual anxieties. We didn't lose the desire to preserve childhood wonder in a world that remains capable of darkness. What we lost were the specific conditions that made expressing those needs feel possible, feel communal, feel real. The 1950s weren't perfect. The Christmas they created wasn't authentic in the way we romantically imagine. But they got something right that we've forgotten. They treated belief itself as valuable. They built elaborate systems, commercial, military, cultural, familial, dedicated to preserving the idea that magic exists. They understood, perhaps because they had recently lived through its absence, that societies need shared moments of wonder to survive. When a military commander takes a call from a crying child and pretends to be Santa, that's not efficient. When families spend weeks making paper decorations by hand when store-bought options exist, that's not rational. When the entire nation stops to watch the same Christmas special at the same time, that's not optimized for individual preference. But it was meaningful. It created something that we are still trying to recreate, still reaching for, still mourning. Christmas in the 1950s meant everything because an entire generation decided it should. They chose to invest time, money, emotion, and national resources into creating magic for their children. They chose to build traditions even when those traditions were brand new. They chose to believe together, and that collective belief created something real. We can't go back. The economic conditions, the cultural unity, the technological limitations that made 50s Christmas possible are gone. But we can ask ourselves what we're willing to build in their place. We can ask what we're willing to invest in collective wonder. We can ask whether we're treating belief itself as valuable or as something to be optimized away in favor of efficiency and individual choice. The magic of Christmas isn't lost because the 50s ended. It's endangered because we've stopped agreeing that magic matters more than convenience, that wonder matters more than productivity, that some things should be protected even when they're not rational. If you felt that something essential about Christmas has disappeared, you're not wrong. What disappeared was a collective commitment to preserving it. So here's my final challenge to you. Don't just watch this video and feel nostalgic. Don't just share it and move on. Ask yourself what you're willing to do to create magic for the people around you. What ritual will you protect? What belief will you invest in? What will you choose to make sacred in a world that treats nothing as sacred? The 50s had specific answers to those questions, answers that worked for their moment. We need to find answers that work for ours. Subscribe to this channel if you want to keep exploring the moments in history when humanity got something right even imperfectly. And remember, magic isn't found. It's made. The question is whether we're still willing to do the work.